Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I'm walking home from the train. In fact, you can hear a different train roaring by in the background right now, perhaps, depending how good the sound removal software in Audacity is. Woo! It is a noisy train. It's a beautiful day here in suburban Chicago. It's mid-April, April 18th, tax day. If you don't have your taxes in yet, better get them in today. And the weather has been up and down like a yo-yo. Last week, it got up into the 80s. There were 2 days where the high temperature was in the 80s. And then this weekend, it got cold again. On Sunday, the high was 33. And now today, it is back up into the 60s. So, yowza. And I was looking next weekend, it's going to be in the 40s again. So, it's just up and down, up and down. So, I'm walking home. I have my fairly warm jacket wadded up in a ball in my backpack because this morning it was cold and now it's quite nice. You didn't really tune in for an update on the weather. What you tuned in for was a podcast about board games, and that's what you're going to get. So today I am going to be talking about the movies that I watched in March of 2023. That's right, it's the March Movie Roundup. For those of you who have not heard this kind of segment before, each month I do a brief review of the movies that I watched in the previous month, and I talk a little bit about what I thought of them, and I connect them with a game, either thematically or emotionally or, I don't know, aesthetically. The idea is just to give you a light sense of what it might be like to play a game alongside this movie. And generally I'll talk about 4 or 5 movies, sometimes more. Just depends on how many I'm able to talk about before we get to the end of my walk. If you'd like to learn more about these movies and what I thought about them, generally whenever I watch a movie, I write a brief film review and I post it on Letterboxd, which of course, because it is in a website in the 2020s, it has to be written with some letters missing. So it's like Letterbox and then with a D at the end, but without an E, letterboxd.com. And you can find links to that from the Pick Up and Deliver show notes for this episode over on rataboxgames.com. So with all of that laid out, why don't we get into it? I'm going to talk about the movies that I watched in March of 2020. The first one I watched as part of a special challenge, the Forgot My Dice podcast, which is one of my faves, hosted by Jonathan and Robert. They are doing a series right now where they are watching Stephen King movies. They're watching every Stephen King movie based on a novel or a novella. I think they're skipping the short stories. And they recently went by Dreamcatcher, which is actually a novel I read. I read it in audiobook form. I think it was one of those times where I was just looking for another audiobook to read and they had it at the library. It was sort of a convenience thing. But I picked it up and enjoyed it thoroughly. So the novel, I remember enjoying the novel quite a bit, although there were some parts of it that were pretty weird. So this is the film based on that novel, and boy, yikes, this is not a good movie. This is one of those movies that really, so I watched it because the guys on the podcast really specifically wanted to hear my thoughts on it, and I posted some brief thoughts, but it really was pretty execrable in many ways. What's interesting about it is the cast is incredible. Like, you look at a list of the people who are in this movie, and it's hard to understand how it could have done so poorly. For example, you have Damian Lewis, you have Morgan Freeman, you have Tom Sizemore. Those are sort of 3 biggest names. But you've also got Jason Lee, you've got Timothy Olyphant, I think is his name. You have Donnie Wahlberg in a really kind of offensive role. And it's all about these sort of aliens that are trying to invade, and they have this sort of parasitic worm that is spread through small droplets, and then you get the egg in you and it grows into this horrifying snake thing that hatches other worms. At some point it turns into a large alien. That's unclear, the relationship between the terrifying worm things and the large things. It's gross violations of body horror. See, I don't know if a body getting torn apart is body horror or not, but yeah, it's pretty gross. And all of these things together really should have resulted in a good film, and it just is not a good film, really in any way. And so I do not recommend watching it because it's not good. So it does sort of beg the question of what is the game to play with it? I mean, this is maybe mean. Since I haven't played it, it's really mean, but there's a sort of legendarily bad game that I have a copy of and have never played that's sort of known for being like the first game to try to make The Thing into a board game. It's called Panic Station. On this game, there are alien parasites running around, and the players come in and they try to find and kill the alien parasites. The thing is, if you encounter one, it can get into you and then you become infected and you're part of the villain team. And if you encounter another player and they don't attack you, then you have to do an exchange. And if in the exchange one of you passes a parasite to the other, now the other's infected as well. When I read the rules, when I first got it, I got it in a trade and I read the rules and I thought it sounded amusing, but it was a little confusing. And then every single thing I've seen about it, people talk about it as a bad game. So I don't know whether it really deserves that reputation or not. And I've held on to it all this time because I don't know. I don't like to get rid of a game before I try it. But so maybe a bad movie about aliens infesting people with parasites and a bad game about it. Dreamcatcher, try it out with Panic Station, I guess. The next game I want to talk about is What Happened to Monday. This is a science fiction thriller with an interesting, if kind of stupid premise, but the idea is that it's in a world where overpopulation is the brutal reality of things, that we're having a problem with overpopulation because we can't produce enough food. And then some genetic engineering is done to produce more food, to make dramatically more fertile food plants. And then in the classic sci-fi trope, that ends up making people much more fertile as well. And so even though we solve the food problem, we then have another blooming overpopulation problem. And by this point, of course, the world has a single government. And the proposal is made that whenever a family has multiple children, each family is allowed to have one child. And any additional children that are found are taken by the government child authority and put into cryosleep for sometime in the future when we'll have enough room for everybody. That's the premise of the movie, or the premise of the world building. And then the premise of the movie is you have this one rich eccentric who, his daughter and son-in-law have 7 children in one, septuplets. And his son dies somehow, or the son-in-law dies somehow, and the daughter dies during childbirth. So then grandpa is left with these 7 babies. And he pays off the people who helped give them birth, and then he builds a secret bunker for them to live in, and he constructs a system by which they get to share one life as 7 people. So there's one name for the group of them that is the identity they share outside the world, but inside the house they just have different days of the week that are their names. And the idea is that each of them gets to go out of the house one day of the week and they all pretend to be the same person, and that's how they live their life. So that's the premise. And then of course one day Monday goes out to go to work. She has a big presentation and she doesn't come home. And this leads to a thriller in which the other 6 of them have to try to figure out what happened to her and find her. The main actor who plays it is Rappaport, the one who was in Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I can't remember her name, but she's pretty good. You have Willem Dafoe as Grandpa. Then there's a number of other people. I can't remember his name, but the lead person in charge of the security is a known actor. And then the president is played by Glenn Close. Like I said, it's a thriller with lots of gunfire and fights and running and fighting and excitement. Overall, an amazing movie. I don't know, amazing. Entertaining movie. I'd recommend it. What Happened to Monday? This is not a game for which I can think of a clear board game analog. It's very story heavy. I would say probably one of the Escape Tales. That's the one. Escape Tales feels like the game that would be the most similar in that it's got this kind of creepy story. It's interesting and amusing and kind of thrilling. So what happened to Monday and Escape Tales. All right, I had a bout of like a 24-hour stomach bug, During that time, I watched 2 movies on our streaming services, just stuff that I was like, what's something that is going to take 0 mental energy to watch, will be moderately amusing. And so I picked The Day the Earth Stood Still, the Keanu Reeves early 2000s remake of the classic sci-fi movie, which I have to say, good casting on making Keanu Reeves seem like somebody who looks kind of like a human, but definitely is not. When he wants to play odd, he really can. And it suggests that The Matrix might have been a really interesting movie with him as Agent Smith instead of the guy who played Agent Smith, Hugo Weaving. But Hugo Weaving did a great job. But I'm just saying, Neo can knock out the strange metahuman if he wants to. But that was the only good part of that movie. Otherwise, that movie was garbage, and you should just watch the original one, which was much more coherent and interesting and entertaining. So, yeah, check out the original The Day the Earth Stood Still, rather than the remake. If I'm going to put a game with that, I'll say Moonga Invaders, which isn't really the same, but still has science fictional attack on Earth's integrity. So, there you go, kind of. And then I also watched Ender's Game, which it comes up really short as far as adaptations of a science fiction classic go. The problem is that just too much stuff happens in the movie or in the book to make for a good single movie. You don't have time to grow to love the characters well enough. You just don't have enough time. So, I mean, Ender's Game would have worked much better as a trilogy. You could have had, well, it just would have been better. The story is too much for a single movie. Also, for some inexplicable reason, probably because they had to have the kids basically stay the same age, instead of having Ender's training for battle school take several years, they have it take like 3 months. And that part just felt stupid, just dumb. So, boo on Ender's Game. I'm not even going to suggest a game to play with it, although I know there is a board game version. There's a board game based on the movie. So, go ahead and get that if you want, I guess. So I have 2 movies left. I saw a clip of it and it made me want to rewatch it, so I rented and rewatched The Martian, the Matt Damon movie based on the Andy Weir novel. Very good. I really enjoyed that. Up until like the very last moment is kind of dumb, but almost all of the rest of it is really good. It's a great movie about solving problems and trying to deal with stuff. I would say First Martians, the adaptation of the Robinson Crusoe game, seems like the best version of that, in that it has building a fledgling Martian colony and trying to survive a lot of problems. That seems to fit pretty well with what happens in The Martian. So I would say those 2 go together. Although, again, almost every game I've recommended here I haven't actually played, and I can't say I've heard any good things about First Martians. And then finally, I watched Birdman, or The Unexpected Virtue of Ignorance. This is a movie that won Best Picture, sort of really well known for giving Michael Keaton some room to kind of think about what it meant to have played Batman early on and have that be sort of your most significant role, and then sort of living on the glory of that. And then it was a really interesting sort of theatrical event and it's a super weird movie. So I really enjoyed it, and I can't say, I mean, it's a weird movie with deep character development that it's just unlike most things I've seen. Really interesting, worth watching if you like more artsy movies. That said, gosh, what game would be? I'm inclined, I don't know where this comes from, but I'm inclined to say the movie Voices in My Head, or the game Voices in My Head, which is a recent game that comes out where you are competing voices inside the head of a person on trial for some sort of crime. Might be an interesting doubling up, because a big part of Birdman is this sort of self-acknowledgement or self-recrimination. Yeah, I'm going to say Voices in My Head. So I think this is a record. Every game I've recommended today are games I've heard about but not played. So take that for what you will. And that brings me to the end of my walk today. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.